Hello and happy Thursday, and welcome to AROYA Office Hours. My name is Keisha. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. Just a couple of reminders before we get started. This hour is your chance to hear from the experts, get answers in real time about data you're seeing with your grow, and share cultivation tips and tricks with other growers in this exciting industry. Thank you, everybody, in advance for not using this time for things like airing policy or industry grievances or asking about AROYA pricing, although please do book a demo and we'll talk all about that with you. Everybody who's on with us today, please feel free to type your questions in the chat at any time. And if your question is selected, we'll have you unmute yourself and ask away. Another thing you're going to want to type in the chat is your email address, because we're going to have a raffle giving away one of our limited edition t-shirts. And for first-time question askers, we also want to send you an AROYA hat. So drop your email address in the chat. Seth and Jason, how you guys doing today?
Doing pretty good.
Yeah.
Doing good, Keisha. How about yourself?
Doing good. You know who else is on? Another member of the Root Zone Club. We got Mandy in the house today.
Hey, Mandy.
What's up, Mandy?
Hey, everyone.
Yeah, the gang is all here. So Michael, who's on the call with us today. Michael, we saw that you raised your hand. You have a question? Maybe you want to kick us off today? And if not, if you want to type it in the chat, I can ask. Oh, all good. Just saying hi. Perfect. Okay. So we're going to start with a couple questions we got from Instagram. So Dope Farm submitted these two great questions this week. So here they are, guys. How do you handle generative steering the first week of flower plants aren't rooted in? So we'll start with that one first.
Plants aren't rooted in. So this is probably one of the biggest differences for the beginning of crop steering during flower is whether those plants are rooted in or not. So some of our clients are able to get their plants into the final media during the end of veg, and so they enter into flower with their plants rooted in. In this case, if our plants are not rooted in and we're transferring onto slabs right when we're flipping flower, transferring onto our 1 or 2 gallon coco medias, then usually we'll go through some steps called rooting in and dry down. And really what this is just a specific strategy in order to get the roots to reach out, engulf as much media as possible before we start pushing some more serious drybacks.
Yeah, and what that typically looks like is very little tiny irrigations, 1 to 3 max. But you're probably going to start on about day 2 or 3 and watch that line. You're not going to actually bring it back up to peak saturation like a P1 watering. We're just giving it a small bump to push oxygen down in and give basically the roots a path to follow. We want downward movement from the block into the slab. And we want to put a little water on every day just to keep that aerobic. If we wait too long, we can get some nasty stuff growing in that slab before we root in, and we want to avoid that. But after about 3 to 5 days, you should be drying back close to 10 to 15% from your, initial soak up on the block, and at that point we know the plant's actually taken up water, and we can start to hit it with some P1s and start steering it generatively.
Yeah, always, good practice to go in there and peek at your roots a little bit. If you're in a slab, go into the slitted end, see if you're starting to see those pop out of the bottom and the side. If you're in something like a coco bag, look down the side of it, or just start looking down the drain holes, or looking up at the drain holes from underneath, and look for those nice white healthy roots. And the white roots are going to indicate a good oxygen balance. If your roots are starting to brown out and stuff, then you probably need to have a little bit more oxygen down in that root zone to keep them happy. Conversely, if we start irrigating a little too much before the root zone's engulfed, those roots might get lazy on us a little bit, and they're not going to seek out fresh media and try and engulf the entire volume of that substrate.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So the second part of their question was, what do you do for generative steering end of flower when plants are drying back too hard?
Yeah, so generative strategy towards the end of flower, it's a time that we like to call ripening. Obviously, what we're doing there is giving the plant a little bit of an end of life cycle, get as much development in those trichomes, make sure they're getting amber, try and basically finish off the amount of product that can come out of there. So the strategies, if we are seeing dry back too much, it's a time that you may not get really concerned about drying back too much. Really, one of the things there is just thinking about how long you are running that last ripening strategy for. For some types of plants, 2 weeks might be a good amount of time. If you are hitting really heavy drybacks early on in that 2 weeks, then you got to kind of make a compromise. Some plants are going to ripen up a little bit easier. Maybe we're on a 5-day ripening phase. In that case, if you're hitting really heavy drybacks, that's a good sign that you've maximized the usage of your root zone and that your plants are healthy and happy, and the end is near.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to look at there is, proper media to plant size. So when we go into generative steering during ripening, if our plant has overgrown the media, that's what we're going to see. It's the plant drying back way too fast. It's pulling water out quicker than we want it to. And, one of the main strategies there is to come in at the end of the day, wait as long as we can until 2 hours or 1 hour before lights off, and then hit it with a maintenance shot, and it's okay to bring that all the way back up to peak saturation, but sometimes too, you might only need 1/6% shot to correct going too low. And one thing to watch out for too, right at the end there, those big drybacks are good, but we don't want to, for instance, push it so far that we wilt the plant. That's going to stall us out a little bit, maybe cause some mold. So we got to keep in mind like our media properties. With rock wool, for instance, we're going to push it farther and farther towards the end there on the drybacks because we're getting closer and closer and we're not trying to push growth. But we still want that media to be able to hold enough water so that we have a reservoir to make it through the day. So an important part about going into ripening, especially in rock wool, is keeping your water content up higher earlier on so you don't have a low field capacity going in. And then remembering that you need to come all the way back up to field capacity with your P1s. And if you start drying down below that 35% or so, just know that you're not going to get the same field capacity. So you don't want to put yourself in a downward trend and then suddenly go vegetative the last week just because you're throwing water on it every hour to keep them from wilting.
I love it. Direct advice from the Root Zone Club itself. Great. So we have another question. Actually, it was submitted to us on Instagram, but it looks like Max is on with us today. So Max, I'm going to read your question, but you're welcome to unmute yourself and chime in if you're ready. Max wrote us, I would like to hear a bit about vegetative steering in flower after stretch. We had a successful gen steer for the first 21 days. Flowers started forming by day 11, and the node spacing is the best it's been since. I'd like to keep this trend going with a good veg steer and then go back to gen and late flower. I currently only have a water content sensor in one of my 1G coco pots and have one of the manual probes to read WC and EC. Max, you want to unmute yourself? Anything to add to that?
I have just one Trollmaster water content sensor for now, so that's what we're starting with, and it seemed to be helping. So I just want to continue on that positive trend.
Gotcha. I think, one of the biggest things when trying to switch from gen to vegetative steering, or what I like to call bulking during flower, is, basically not going, too terribly low in your water content, and then timing it with the cues the plant gives us. So part of that's going in there every day, every other day early on, every day, probably, especially the first time you're running a strain, and determine the day it actually stops stretching. When am I going in and measuring and saying, okay, has the exact same measurement today as it did yesterday, possibly as it did the day before, just as a little insurance. But we don't want to hit bulking until stretching has fully stopped in the whole plant. And one thing you'll notice will happen sometimes is you'll have side branches that don't stretch so much if you go into bulking early. And part of that's because those branches have matured. Their cell walls have hardened up. They're not going to stretch anymore. But your main apical meristem, your main branch, cola, if you haven't topped it, sometimes can keep stretching longer than those side branches. So if you flip into bulking too early, you're going to encourage more stretch, and that's what we want to avoid. So, in vegetative steering, the more irrigations we can put on, the better, generally speaking. But also that timing is very important. If we miss the timing cue, we're just not going to get the desired results.
Yeah, and to add on to the plant height timing cues, taking good crop registration is going to be the most helpful way to improve strain by strain performance at a facility. And so when we talk about when to take those measurements, I like to take them late through the vegetative cycle, your 18-6, and then all the way up to a few days or a few weeks into the vegetative bulking phase. And a really critical number there is what was the plant height when you went from veg to flower. So when you flip to 12-12, what is that plant height? And that's how you're going to be able to maximize the plant size for a given strain based on that time frame, and then keep your consistency to hit that timing cue for your change in crop steering practices as a consistent time to time for that strain.
Yeah, and that record keeping is super important, because I'll even run strains that I have friends that run, and my stretch will last 2-3 days longer just because my room runs a little colder, and I'm not making money on it, so I don't care if I heat it up to gain that extra couple days. But that's the thing, when you're getting information out there too, we don't really have, the perfect standard of a grow room set. And even if we did, the range of how well people have been able to achieve that is pretty wide. So it's about figuring out how it's working in your facility and then adapting to it.
Sweet. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're so glad you were able to join us today. And actually, since you were able to come on, if you are able to type your email address in the chat, we would love to reach out to you and send you an AROYA hat, maybe a t-shirt if you win the raffle.
Sweet.
Yes. Amazing. Yes. And a reminder to everybody who's on with us, we want to hear from you. Ask us your questions. Let's get you some answers. Okay. This next one, and it's a good one. This comes from Musa Magic. They write from Australia. I'm going to read the whole thing, but I think it's an opportunity for us to kind of give an overview. So they wrote, I have a couple of questions regarding pruning that I don't believe has been touched on. I'd like to get some clarity on how can the AROYA platform impact our pruning SOPs? How has the data you guys have collected changed your pruning techniques? And what new pruning SOPs have you found were successful that have derived from the collated data captures in the platform? So Seth and Jason, just kind of a general overview about how AROYA can help with tasks like pruning.
Yeah, we do what's called a harvest group recipe. I also like to call it a grow cycle template. That's where you build out all the desired parameters for the room, irrigation strategies, and then your tasking and IPM management for all harvest group. Nice thing about this is you can plop in there the pruning tasks, and you can make sure that you've got those on the appropriate days for different types of strains. You can drop your SOP right into that AROYA task. You can assign that task. You can set that task up to have an employee reminder so that your employees get a text message in the morning when they're supposed to be doing that type of activity. So that's one way that we kind of just help you organize, especially on larger grows. This becomes critical because we'll have so many offset cycles that it's hard to keep track of which room needs what type of tasking on a day-to-day basis. And that's also a good way to keep that visibility. It's pinging your employee. You've got that information right in there. You can attach some pictures to detail what the appropriate pruning looks like. Your employee can go in and do a completed task. They can time that task, say, hey, when we spend 12 hours pruning, we get less results than when we spend only 8 hours pruning. Well, let's save that 4 hours. Let's do something else with it, have a little bit better product. And by tracking that and comparing it is really the only way that you'll know the best pruning practices for a strain.
Yeah, to build on that, we also calculate a rough idea of leaf area index, so you can see how quickly certain strains fill out. And also by looking at water intake by the plants on the graph, you can really start to see how much, let's say a late pruning is going to, impact growth. So if we go strip a bunch of leaves around week 6, we're going to see that plant really slow down on water uptake because it doesn't have the plumbing to continue to uptake it. It doesn't have that stomata. And then we can start to look at, okay, this run when we did that, here was our yield. All right, now also we've built in, just as Jason was saying, that recipe. Well, if you can go into the schedule in each harvest group and modify that for each individual run, you really have a precise idea of when things happen without flipping through notebooks and binders. And, everything's so cyclical that when you've run one strain, let's say 50 times, and you've done a bunch of different things over the last couple of years to try to get that thing to perform the way you want, it starts to turn into, yeah, we did it a little late that time, or remember that day last spring. And it's like, well, what run was that? Oh, I don't know, 34? I thought it was 37, So really that crop registration is key. And, just starting to analyze your data. And a big part of that too is not only having the graphs, but keeping your manual readings, taking pictures, just quantifying everything you can in your grow so you have all those points to compare.
Again, it's all about making growers' lives easier. We love those questions. Thank you so much. Okay, Max just typed into the chat here. He wrote, I'd like to hear a bit about clone rooting drybacks because I don't believe clone sensors are a thing yet. What are your thoughts on that?
So my favorite sensor for clones is a kitchen scale or maybe your drug scale from selling baggies a while ago. And as long as you've got a high enough capacity on that, you just put your clone tray on the scale, keep a reading of it, throw a tray that doesn't have any plants but has substrate on that, use that as a zero aspect. And then obviously every 1 gram increase on the scale is a milliliter of water. And so you can track your drybacks by having the reference points of a dry media clone tray with a fully saturated media clone tray. And then in between is going to be your different amounts of water content based on that scale weight. So that's a pretty easy way to do. It is obviously manual sampling, but it's going to be a very accurate assumption of water content. Obviously, the plant weight itself, the biomass of the plant is going to play a role in that number as well. It's fairly negligible at the size of those clones, so you get to be a pretty close approximation of what processes you need for irrigating clones.
Yeah, and just remember too that no matter how much you monitor that, you're still going to be irrigating. You're still going to be giving it water really regularly to promote an aerobic environment. Those plants aren't going to root if they just all get infected. So you can really use that weight, as Jason was describing, to start timing those irrigations. But you've got to remember, if you're going 3-4 days without adding any water or flushing any oxygen through that root zone, you're probably going to see a lot of clone death. So you can push it certain ways, but keeping it as simple as possible is generally the key with clones. And remembering, important things like making sure you've got a tray or maybe some perlite under your rock wool in there to get good aeration at your root zone. One thing I like to do personally, and everyone's got a weird variation on how they like to clone, but for a lot of strains, I actually like to push it down all the way through the block and pull it back up so that every time I flush water through the bottom of that tray, I've got fresh oxygen going right to where those roots are trying to form. But another key thing there is just consistency. So much of your cloning is in the technique. I wish there was an irrigation recipe that was perfect for every strain. Obviously, that's quite different. But in my experience, a huge part of cloning success is consistency with the people that are doing the clones. That part of it is, someone told me once that horticulture is an art and a science, and that's very much the art side of it.
Cleanliness during cloning is going to play a big part as far
Yes.
as that consistency goes. So, as far as the health of your mom's going to play a big part into your clone consistency, how well that you're keeping clean so that you're not infecting some of those plants. And then, like Seth is saying, making sure that you've got high quality staff that is very prudent in their process for cloning. And crop uniformity, it's a parameter that you can apply all the data that you want to a set. You can crop steer as perfectly as you want, but the more uniform that crop is, the easier all of your analysis is going to be, and overall the better yield that you'll get.
Yep, we want to start out with the best foundation. If your plant's as healthy as possible, you don't need to put Band-Aids on it later to try to get it in shape.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. All right. Our friend Michael is on with us today and typed into the chat here. What are your feelings on increasing lights on time to increase DLI? And what phases, if any, would you run it?
So let's just start from the beginning. When you're running clones, you can do 24 hours lights on. We see it every once in a while. To the veg phase, 18.6, pretty hard to beat. And then since cannabis, other than autoflowers, are photoperiodic type plants, you really need to keep with that 12-12. So as far as modifying lights on time, I don't usually recommend it, unless you're just trying to get a few more hours during your veg cycle. Best thing you can do to increase your DLI is run a little higher intensity lights.
Yep, exactly. I mean, and basically with all strains, there's a level of determinants. So basically, cannabis is generally an indeterminate plant until we switch to 12-12, then it's got a timer. Whereas autoflower plants are determinate, and then there's a lot of strains that land somewhere in between those two growth phases, depending on how many copies of those determinant genes they have. So unless you're running one strain over and over and over forever, you're introducing a variable that's going to be really hard to track and really just create a lot of work to try to analyze how that's affecting every single strain you've got in the room.
Great. Michael, thank you so much for your question. I know we are good friends with you, but if you want to be entered into our t-shirt raffle, drop your email address in the chat. All right, we got a question from Bilbo Baggins. I don't know if it's the Bilbo or not, but they write, when searing in a medium made from peat, coco, and a lot of organic matter, I am seeing VWC data that left me initially very perplexed. I think I have tracked the VWC to a high CEC/TEC and organic matter content of the substrate. My question is, have you ever crop steered in a high CEC substrate? What was it like for you?
So we're just going to break this down for everyone in the audience. CEC is cation exchange capacity. A simple way to explain it is talking about how much charge in the substrate, how it holds on to nutrients, right? So on one end of the spectrum, we've got rockwool, which has a very, very low, almost zero CEC, meaning that when we make changes to irrigation, the incoming irrigation in that substrate, it's going to be very reactive. So if we drop to zero EC on the feed, that rockwool is going to very, very quickly get down to zero EC. Now, what sounds like Bilbo Baggins is working with is organic material. That's going to be on the other side of the spectrum, where you can drop to something like a zero EC, and it's going to take a long time in order to drop the EC in that substrate. So that organic matter is, this is why we see time release nutrients and additives in soil substrates, is simply because the nutrients are going to be hanging on to that substrate for a while.
Yep. And I mean, that's why when you look at like a lot of bigger ag industries, we're putting on salt fertilizers a couple times a year. And partially that's just because we're working with soil. And it sounds like with Bilbo Baggins, you're working with something. It's a soilless mix, but it's amended to the point where it has a similar CEC as soil. So we do have customers that do that. What you're looking at, though, is crop steering purely through irrigation inputs and less through your direct injection of EC into the root zone. So yes, you can crop steer, but not quite to the degree of control that you would have with other systems.
Yeah, and one of the best things to think about as well is just the reactivity of that crop steering. So if we take crop steering literally as steering, well, rockwool is going to be your Lamborghini. It's going to steer pretty quickly. The higher the CEC that we're working with, that water holding capacity in something that's organic, like you're working with, it's going to steer a little bit more like a semi truck. So it just keeps a heads up on what's coming ahead, because you're going to have to do a little bit of predictions in order to make that crop steering happen as fast as something that's purely hydroponic.
Awesome. Thank you. Bilbo posted another question here. They are asking, do you have any future plans for DO readings within the AROYA architecture? SOPs. Thoughts on that?
DO being dissolved oxygen. So this is the amount of oxygen that is dissolved, usually in something like a feed tank or an injection line. As far as plans to read dissolved oxygen in AROYA, we are working on a product that is going to support a number of different sensor inputs. So something like a 4 to 20 milliamp, which a lot of the DO sensors are, can be plugged into it. We don't currently have a timeline on the release for that, but it is something that we'd love to be logged in the system.
Yeah, and to add to that for SOPs there, it's on the list for sure. Having SOP and selectable task lists so you can save stuff like that. Although right now, when you build out your recipe, my favorite move is just copy and paste the SOP for each task I create in there. Once that's in the system, I can copy that recipe, modify it for my different strains, and not have to re-enter those SOPs, and also have those SOPs available whenever an employee clicks on the task.
Awesome. Thank you. Bilbo also just posted, do you have an API connection?
Yeah, we do. So we offer an open API. It's going to provide any of the sensor data coming from our system. So hit us up and we can get a token built for your account. And you can start pulling that data into any system that you'd like.
We've thought of everything so far. Awesome, Bilbo. Thank you so much for your questions, and drop your email address in the chat. We want to send you a hat and enter you in the drawing for a t-shirt. All right. And then just a reminder, everybody else who's on with us, we want to hear from you too. Post some questions in the chat, but we have a few more from Instagram in the meantime here. Nate Meltz wrote in, hey, AROYA team, I was wondering if you know if purple stems and slow growth have anything to do with poor EC and water content of soil. Thank you. I've been trying to get to the bottom of this issue, but I keep getting the same problems.
Possibly. This is going to be very, very strain dependent, and a lot of other parameters such as room temperature, that type of thing. Good way to check if it is related to your nutrient levels is keep an eye on your pH of the runoff. So if you see your pH in runoff quite a bit higher than your feed pH, this could be an indication that you might be feeding at a little bit too low of EC, and the nutrient composition is coming out of balance. So that plant might be hungry for specific ions or cations in solution, and that's why you'll see that pH drift up. So yeah, if everything else checks off, then try giving your plant a little bit more food.
Yeah, I mean, that can be part of it. I also like to just look at everything else in there, so are we maintaining a good enough temperature early on? Let's look at all the factors that can inhibit that plant's growth, because unless you just switched your fertilizer and now you're suddenly encountering this problem, it's not necessarily going to be fertilizer. Like, that's what we always want to jump to, right? Like, oh, I'm going to throw some CalMag at this and it's going to fix it. But sometimes it's a totally different issue. And when we're talking about plants with purple stems, or let's say purple petioles, some plants will express anthocyanin as a form of EC stress. Some it's cold stress. Some just produce a lot of anthocyanin. So when we just look at, say, red stripes on the stems, purple petioles, that's not necessarily telling me that you have a deficiency. But if the plant's growing slow, I mean, there's a few things I would look at. Unless you've got, light yellowing, your classic rust spots from calcium deficiency, any of that, I would really look, as Bilbo Baggins put it, look at your water content. See if you're overwatering and not giving those roots enough oxygen early on to fully develop. A lot of times when we see plant growth slow, it can even be pathological, but generally speaking, the rooting in, especially if you're in rock wool, is something that people struggle with the most. As Jason was saying, people will put it on. If you overwater that slab right away, you've got a weak root system. You're just not going to get that explosive growth that we're looking for.
Got to exercise those roots. Get that plant working for its water, and it's going to pull water hard.
Well, something to remember too, those plants, those roots don't have chlorophyll. They have cellular respiration just like you and I, and they need oxygen to do their job. So if we're not getting it, and that's part of what the dryback is. We're penetrating that root zone with oxygen. We're giving them everything they need to grow. If they're weak, they just won't support growth.
That's great. I love it. I really love it when folks who are on with us type in comments as we go too, because this is about a community. We like to hear from all of you and what's working for you too. All right, my friends, we got a few questions in about sensors. So Canacost, they asked, I bought 4 of the Solus 12 off Amazon. It says it's from Forever Green Indoors. I'm curious why, when I completely submerge all 3 prongs, the app only reads 70% moisture. It's in a 100% water content and still reading at 66 to 70%.
So the substrate sensor, it's not designed to be reading the water content of a completely water solution. And so that's the basis of it. What's happening is that sensor is calibrated for soilless substrate, and And that calibration curve is probably what you're seeing. Another thing that is just going to depend on the size of the water container that you put it in. That sensor is reading about 1 liter volume of influence. So volume of influence being the amount of substrate around the sensor that it is capturing for that reading value. So obviously if you're in a solo cup, you're going to be reading quite a bit of air because it's nowhere near 1 liter.
Great. And actually, our next questions are about the TEROS 12. So French Flair asks, they want to know how to clean the TEROS 12 and what to avoid.
Great question. So pretty much any of your cleaning products that you have on your site, you can use hydrochloric acid, you can use bleach. My favorite is probably just isopropyl alcohol, and just wipe them down. One of the things that you want to avoid is using anything that's too abrasive on there. So let's avoid Scotch-Brite. Let's avoid sandpaper or anything that's a little bit more aggressive. They can modify the surface parameters of those prongs, and that'll change what your readings should be. If you have some really stubborn salt buildup on there, you can just let that TEROS 12 head soak for an hour, soak overnight, and it's not going to hurt the sensor itself. Obviously, with the remote module, we don't like to ever see those being submerged, but the 3-pronged sensor head itself is fully waterproof. So leave it in a bucket of hydrochlorous or any of your other favorite cleaning products that are on site.
Honestly, dish soap works great. Soak it in there for a while, give her a scrub, let them out to dry, and then use your sanitizing agent of choice for a wipe down. And like Jason said, just typically don't try to submerge your radio transmitter in whatever cleaning solution you're using. Obviously, we want to sanitize those, but a wipe is totally fine.
Yeah, we've gotten a couple comments here. Michael wrote, the hypochlorous acid works great for everything. Sounds like you can relate to that one. And then Max wrote, when calibrating a sensor in coco, flood to field capacity, and once it stops dripping, calibrate to 100%. Follow-up to that would be, is 100% something we ever actually want to achieve outside of calibration? I've seen lots of graphs that don't go over 60 to 70%.
So what we measure is actually volumetric water content. We're looking at the total volume of the media. I think you're referring to, Max, is saturation. So 100% of the water holding capacity of that media would be the saturation. So if you're saying you've seen a lot of graphs don't go over 60 to 70%, that is 100% saturation for that media. What we're doing is looking away to compare a bunch of different medias to each other. And also, just so you know, our sensors the T12 specifically does not calibrate. And part of that is because we're looking at a standard, which is volumetric water content, not a relative reading, which would be saturation.
So the simple way I like to think about it is if I have a gallon of substrate, then when I'm at 60% water content, that means 60% of my substrate is water. The remaining 40% is going to be a little bit of air pockets and solid material itself. So if it's coco, that means that the remaining 40% is coco and air, and there's 60% in there.
Love it. We are on a roll today. So many good questions coming in. All right, Bilbo posted another good one. 2. I'm going to start with the first one. Can you speak to osmotic pressure within the various substrates and how it relates to room and air VPD?
Oh, you're going to get a little detailed on us here, big guy.
We need the whiteboard for this one. Basically, when you have a higher salt content, it's harder for the plant to pull up that water, right? So we need more mechanical suction from the air above to pull that water through the plant. It's basically that simple. As one goes up, so does the other for the plant to uptake water. And then the difference between resistive water content.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Second question. Can you explain the difference between resistive water content sensors, VWC, TDR, matrix potential of water?
Sure. So we'll just go over kind of some of the stuff he's talking about here. TDR would be a time domain reflexometry. Some of the substrate and soil sensors in the market use TDR. We actually use a capacitive reading across our prongs for determining volumetric water content for that VWC. And this is actually going to be a little bit different reading than matrix potential of water. So matrix potential is actually talking about the characteristics of a substrate, how it is holding on to water. And so matrix potential is great when we're out in the field because we know the amount of stress that is being applied to the root zone. So if we're measuring water matrix potential, in the soil, it's the vacuum that the roots needs to apply to the soil in order to pull water. And so if we're in something like sand, then even at very low water contents, that water is available to the roots at a much, we'll call it higher matrix potential. So matrix potential is measured in negative pressure numbers. And so, higher matrix potential is going to mean that the plant water, the water availability to the plant is easier. So that's something like clay. It can have a higher matrix potential number even when it gets to lower water contents. Did I say clay? I meant sand. So the other spectrum where I'm going to is clay. And something like clay, the substrate molecules themselves are hanging on to the water quite a bit more. And so we're going to see the plant get to a closer wilting point even at a higher water content, simply because it's more difficult for the roots to pull that moisture out of the substrate.
Yeah, and the beauty of the soilless media that we work in, you have to go pretty low on water content for the matrix potential to actually play a factor in how hard the plant has to suck on it. I mean, it's a pretty beautiful thing compared to trying to crop steer. Back to trying to crop steer in soil. If we did that, we'd really need to get a soil test. I mean, if not, we at least go out there and, lick some dirt, roll it between our fingers, try to figure out what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and this is why it's nice to be working in hydroponic medias. Is obviously run to run, they're very consistent, and even across the brands, we don't need a matrix potential sensor in order to determine the water release curves. So we've run matrix potential curves on rock wools and cocos and have a very good idea of what those numbers look like as far as a volumetric water content number can translate into. So, matrix potential sensors can usually be a little bit more finicky in installation. And so for any of the known media types, we just simply use a TEROS 12 to achieve the same type of actionable data that we would out of a matrix potential sensor.
Awesome. Thank you. Stizzy Employee 007 just posted a question here. If a rock wool slab reaches max field capacity at 80% after saturation and it's left to dry back below 35%, how much capacity is lost generally to the material becoming hydrophobic?
Yeah, so obviously hydrophobic meaning that it repels water. Hydrophobic being the fear of water, and naturally blown basalt fibers have hydrophobic properties. So any of the rock wool manufacturers actually impregnate some wetting agents into that when the product is shipped, so that when it initially gets soaked up, it can reach field capacity and take full advantage of those properties. That wetting agent is washed out the first time that you fully soak up the slabs. And so, going down past 35% is when we'll see those hydrophobic properties be reintroduced. And it's going to be a little bit different number just depending on the model and manufacturer of that rock wool. If you were at 80% and you didn't go below 35, you probably haven't jeopardized the substrate yet, and you should be able to see that saturation or the field capacity point get pretty close back up to what you've seen.
Yeah, you should. I mean, consistently, especially like if you got one big batch, you'll see it pretty evenly. Like let's say you dry down to 30%, you can expect probably instead of 65% field capacity, which would be pretty typical for a plant that's starting to root in or rooted in, you might see 55. So we already lost maybe 10% there. But the reality is, you at this point, if you've been doing that, you can actually go back and look at your graphs and quantify how much you lose every time you've got a dryback that goes 5% farther than where you want to, 10% farther than where you want to.
Great. So many good questions about substrates. We have one more question that we got from Instagram. Before I ask it, I just want to remind everybody who's on with us, we've got, just a few more minutes. We want to hear your questions and get those answered. So please feel free to drop those in the chat. Ecstatic Pax wants to know, can your soil moisture sensor be used in peat?
Sure it can. Yeah, absolutely. If it is 100% peat mix, then just keep in mind that the calibration might be slightly off, because we do it for a soilless media that is supposedly not of any organic matter, or any organic characteristics, I guess would be a better way to say that. So yeah, just keep in mind that your EC values might be a little bit higher or lower than you're actually reading, simply due to that calibration. But it's going to be very effective for water content and monitoring the dynamics of your EC.
Yeah, I'll be honest. We have not a bunch, but a few clients that are still running peat mix bases, and it's actually quite fine. Like right now, with the market demand on cocoa, you do get quite an inconsistency in CECs in cocoa. None of them are very high, but they range. And peat moss generally has some overlap there. Peat moss itself is very, very low in CEC. It's actually one of the first traditional soilless mixed components that people were using. And then we decided, maybe it's bad to strip mine peat moss bogs, because they take thousands and thousands of years to regenerate. So if there wasn't the negative environmental consequence of peat moss, we'd probably see a lot more of it in the industry, to be perfectly honest.
It's a good consideration. They all have different environmental impacts, huh? Amazing. Okay. Well, that's the last question we got submitted this week. Seth and Jason, thank you so much. And to everyone who joined us today and participated in this discussion, thank you so much as well. This is really what it's about, really spotlighting what's going on with your grow, and hearing from the experts about what works and what doesn't. Seth, Jason, any other final words before we sign off for the day?
We did have one more question pop in, if we want to take the time to grab it here.
Oh, yeah, we do. Thank you, Elias. Elias wrote, would you guys recommend pre-soaking pots, cocoa, before loading plants? I'm having trouble keeping them saturated without overwatering them and getting them to root.
I'm a little confused by the question. We'll just go over kind of some of our usually recommended processes here. Pre-soaking cocoa, yeah, absolutely. My favorite way to do it is at least a day before I'm planting, especially if it's a compressed cocoa. Get those things nice and soaked out. If they already have drain slots in them, you might want to hit them 2 or 3 times to fully uncompress that cocoa and make sure that it's reached the field capacity as best as possible before we are ready to plant into it. If they don't have drain slots already, just fill it up. And wait 24 hours, cut some drain slots, and at any time after that, you can start transplanting your plants into that media.
Yeah, my favorite way to hydrate cocoa, honestly, is with a flood and drain table. Set all your bags out, fill it up, be patient, go wait about an hour, come back, hit her with the hose, drain it off, make sure you've hit field capacity, hit it again with the hose if you need to with that drain plugged, and then go ahead and check it again right before you transplant. But like Jason said, it's nice to do a day in advance. And honestly, that works out better with most logistics situations. Like if I've got a big room to do, I try to get everything set up before lunch, fill the tables, and then go to lunch. So no one can be too much in a hurry and pull it out, It's unfortunately just a patience game. You can try as hard as you can to hydrate, and I've done it, hydrate those cocoa blocks with a hose, break them up by hand, all kinds of things. You're better off just being patient about it and planning for it to take, at least an hour to do that full hydration. And it's cheap insurance, right? It's 1 hour that you go do something else.
At least an hour.
Yeah, preferably as long as you can let it go.
So hard to be patient in cannabis cultivation, isn't it? Elias, thank you so much for your question. Drop your email address in the chat. We want to send you a hat. We got another question here from Sizzy Employee 007. They want to know, do AROYA sensors need to be calibrated or serviced between harvests?
No, they do not. We always do recommend that people clean the substrate sensors, both for an accuracy of the sensor and just for sanitation between those cycles. At most 14s, they should not need any maintenance. If you are doing a room fogging for sanitation, then you might put that Atmos 14 in a Ziploc bag, or simply pull it out of the room when that is going on in there.
Yeah, and just wipe it down, manually. It's pretty simple.
What is the preferred medium to be used with AROYA sensors? I love that question.
All.
Yeah. I think the better way to answer that is how detailed can you operate your facility? If you very, very well maintained parameters, set points for environment and irrigation, then you can run something like rock wool. If you're running in a greenhouse where you may not have quite perfect control over those environmentals, a lot of times the forgivingness of coco can be in your advantage.
Generally, though, a soilless mix is what's gonna allow you to crop steer the hardest, just because we've extended it beyond that irrigation control into fine tuning EC control.
That's great. And I missed Michael's comment earlier, referring to being patient, but he wrote, we set 2x4 trays on carts, 3 high, soak in the trays and transplant onto tables the following day. Sounds like a good strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Michael.
Honestly, biggest thing, Michael, just start sticking those before you transplant, especially if you're in coco, just because of that batch-to-batch inconsistency that we tend to see pretty much regardless of brands you go with. Most of them stay pretty close, but hey, if one batch gets you at 48 and the other at 51, that's nice to know. That's going to change your set points, particularly probably your alert set points.
We got a question asking about what you guys actually personally prefer to grow in. What's your favorite medium to grow in, Seth and Jason?
Coco, rockwool. Like I said, it depends on what kind of facility I get to operate in. Mm-hmm. Out in my hoop house, coco and or more organics are definitely the way I need, because I don't have a ton of control equipment, and it gets cold at night down in here. And if I'm in the laboratory, then rockwool's pretty nice. Yeah,
I basically second that. I'm depending on how reliable your irrigation system is, I tend to lean towards coco until I've, with that particular system, pulled off a successful run with no irrigation breakdowns. But in an ideal world, I prefer rockwool, especially in an indoor setting. It's less mess. Like, that's my biggest gripe with growing with coco for years and years indoors. Sweeping, lots and lots of sweeping. And then, it's not like it's the grossest grit on your hands, but it's just messy compared to rockwool.
There it is. How Seth and Jason do it. Hope everybody took notes. All right, you guys, I think we're at the end of our questions. Again, thank you to everybody who joined us. We are on for an hour. Bilbo, if you have any other questions, you got a few more minutes to ask. Yeah, thank you all so much. We're getting so much great feedback and conversation in the chat. Yeah, Jason, Seth, any final advice for the day?
It's getting into pretty deep growing season for anyone in hoop houses. Hope you all have had a really nice spring and are ready to rock and roll. And for everybody else, keep doing what you're doing. Jump on, watch our shows. Go listen to some of our client success case studies. It's always great to hear about other people in the industry, and hope you always learn and enjoy these sessions.
Yeah, get out there and have fun. Don't get stuck growing too hard. It's finally turned into summer up here in the Northwest, and I gotta say, I'm pretty glad I get weekends right now. If I'm gonna brag a little bit.
Weekends, vacation, we want all that. Yes, amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Don't burn yourself out.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I said, don't burn yourself out on growing. That's the worst.
Yeah, you gotta take rests. Seth and Jason, so good to see you guys. Mandy, thank you for being in the house with me today. And thank you to everyone who joined us. I think I have everybody's email address except one. If Bilbo wants to stick around and let me know their contact info, I'd love to collect it because we want to send you an AROYA hat. But everybody who joined us, thank you so much for joining AROYA Office Hours Live. If you have any questions about AROYA, how it can be used to improve your cultivation production process, or any other topic that you would like covered in a future session, post it in the chat. Shoot us an email at support.aroya@metergroup.com or send us a DM on Instagram. We want to hear from you. We record every session. We'll email everybody in attendance a link to the video from today's discussion, and it'll also be on the AROYA YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and share while you're there. And if you find these conversations helpful, please do spread the word. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.